The war room aboard the Vothrek, Coalition's command vessel, was built to impress. The ceiling was high and curved, made from dark polished stone taken from the homeworld of the Coalition's founding species. The walls were lined with carved records of every great victory the Coalition had ever won. The lighting was low and gold, the kind of light that made commanders feel important. It was the kind of room designed to make anyone who stood inside it believe that whatever decision was made within its walls would be the right one. Tonight the room was full. Commanders from 5 different species filled the long curved seats around the central table. Their uniforms were different colors, their bodies different shapes, but they all wore the same expression, the easy, relaxed look of people who believed the hard part was already done. Holographic maps floated above the table showing human-controlled space in pale blue. Red markers indicated Coalition fleet positions. The red outnumbered the blue by a wide and comfortable margin, and everyone in the room knew it. At the head of the table stood Commander Vreel, young by Coalition standards, sharp-eyed and ambitious. He had never fought a war from the front lines, but he had studied enough of them to speak with great confidence about all of them. He moved a hand through the holographic display and smiled as the red markers shifted into formation around the blue ones, like a fist closing slowly around something small. 7-1, he said. That is our fleet advantage. Their response time to the outer sectors is 42 hours. Our jump capability cuts that to 9. By the time their reinforcements arrive, the engagement will already be finished. There was quiet, satisfied murmuring around the table. One of the commanders from the Drellin species, a wide-bodied creature with 4 arms, leaned back and said something to his neighbor that made both of them laugh. Someone else began talking about what the territory would be worth once it was absorbed into Coalition space. The mood was warm. It was the mood of a celebration that had started a little early. Nobody was watching the far end of the table. Zirith Don sat there alone. He was not a small figure. His kind, the Vothrek, were tall and angular, with gray-blue skin and dark eyes that caught the light in a way that made them look like they were always calculating something. He had served in the Coalition military for 31 years. He had fought in 14 campaigns. His record was longer and more decorated than anyone else in the room, and most of the beings in the chamber had grown up hearing his name spoken with something close to awe. Right now he was staring at the pale blue section of the holographic map, and he had not said a word since the meeting began. Vreel continued presenting the plan. Jump coordinates, assault vectors, projected resistance levels, estimated engagement duration. Every number was clean and confident. Every projection showed a fast, decisive Coalition victory. The assembled commanders nodded along, some of them already asking about post-victory occupation logistics, about resource extraction timelines, about what kind of political message the campaign would send to neutral systems. Watching from a distance, it was when Vreel said, "Their military capacity is well within manageable parameters," that Zirith finally spoke. "You have never faced them." The words were quiet, not aggressive, not loud, but the room heard them. The murmuring stopped. Vreel turned toward the far end of the table with an expression that was not quite irritation, but was heading in that direction. High Commander Zirith, he said, using the title in a way that was polite on the surface and slightly dismissive underneath. Your experience and your record are not in question here. I know they are not, Zirith said. I am not speaking about my record. I am speaking about yours and the records of everyone in this room. He looked around the table slowly, meeting eyes where he could. How many of you have engaged human forces directly in the field under real conditions? Silence. How many of you have read the full reports from the Carven border engagement? Not the summary. The full reports. More silence. A few of the commanders shifted in their seats. Zirith stood up. He was tall enough that the movement drew attention on its own. He walked to the center of the room and stood beside the holographic display. He did not touch it or manipulate it. He just stood there looking at the pale blue markers and then looked back at the room. I have faced humans, he said, 12 years ago, on a border world that does not appear in any public coalition record because what happened there was not something the High Command wished to explain to the broader public. He paused. I survived that engagement. Most of my force did not. And what I learned in those hours is more relevant to what you are planning than anything in this presentation. Vril opened his mouth to speak, but one of the older commanders, Adrelin named Orith, who had fought in 2 wars of his own, held up a hand. Let him speak, Orith said. Vril closed his mouth. He did not look pleased about it. Zirith looked at the map again. He thought about the way the pale blue marker sat there so quietly, so still, so manageable looking. He had thought the same thing once. He had stood in front of a very similar display 12 years ago and felt the same confidence that everyone in this room was feeling now. You are looking at that map, he said, and you are seeing numbers. Fleet count, territory size, response times. You are doing mathematics, and the mathematics looks good for us. I understand that. When I was younger, I would have looked at the same display and felt the same certainty. He turned away from the map and faced the room directly. But I have seen what is behind those numbers. I have stood on the same ground as human soldiers and watched them do things that did not fit any model I had ever been trained to expect. I have given orders that should have worked against any other enemy and watched those orders fall apart, not because of better technology or larger numbers on their side, but because of something else, something that is much harder to account for in a planning document. He let that sit for a moment. What I am going to tell you is not comfortable, he said. Some of you will not believe it. Some of you will tell yourselves that my experience was an exception, that conditions were unusual, that it could not happen again under better planning. You are welcome to think that. But I am asking you, before this vote is taken and this fleet is committed, to listen first, to hear what I saw, to understand what you are choosing to send our forces against. He looked at Vril, then at Orith, then at the rest of the table, one face at a time. Humanity is not what this presentation says it is, he said. And if we go to war with them the way this plan describes, we will learn that the hard way, the same way I did. The room was very quiet now. The warm, celebratory feeling that had filled the space minutes ago had gone somewhere else. In its place was something more careful, more uncertain. Zereth Dawn sat back down at the far end of the table and folded his hands in front of him. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Orith said, "Tell us." And Zereth began. Zereth did not look at the map when he began. He looked at his hands instead, the way someone does when they are pulling a memory out of a place they do not visit often. 12 years ago, he said, the Coalition received intelligence that a small human garrison was operating a mining settlement on the edge of the Carven border. The settlement had no strategic value on its own. It was a foothold, a sign that humans were expanding in a direction the Coalition had marked as future territory. The order came down to remove them. Quietly, 1 battalion, clean and fast. The report back to command would say the settlement was found abandoned. He paused. I volunteered for the assignment. I was younger. I believed genuinely that it would be simple. Nobody at the table said anything. Vreel had taken his seat. Even he was listening now, though his expression was still guarded. We outnumbered them 4-1. Zereth continued. We had better weapons, better armor, better ships. The settlement was a cluster of prefabricated buildings on a cold, flat world with thin air and almost no cover. There was nowhere for them to run. There were no reinforcements within range. By every standard measurement, it was not a fight. It was a removal operation. He looked up from his hands. We hit them at their weakest point. That is what you are supposed to do. We came down hard on the eastern side of the settlement where their vehicle bay was, expecting to destroy their mobility first and then push inward. It was a sound plan. I had used the same approach against 3 other enemies, and it had worked. All 3 times. He stopped again. Not because he was collecting himself, but because he was choosing his words carefully, the way someone does when they know that what they are about to say will sound like an excuse if they are not precise. Within the first 20 minutes we had taken the vehicle bay. It was burning. Their largest equipment was gone. I sent a progress report back to the ship and told them to expect completion within the hour. He shook his head slowly. That was the last report that went the way anyone expected. He described what happened next without drama, and somehow that made it more unsettling. The human garrison had a sergeant named Connor Dale. Zereth did not know his name at the time. He learned it later from captured communications. Connor Dale was not the highest-ranked human in the settlement. He was not the commanding officer. He was a line sergeant, mid-level, the kind of soldier who, in most species, would wait for orders from above before making any significant decision. Connerdale did not wait. Within minutes of the Coalition forces entering the vehicle bay, before the Coalition's main push had even begun, Connerdale had reorganized what was left of the human defenders into 3 separate groups and pushed all 3 of them outward from the center of the settlement in different directions at the same time. Not retreating, not consolidating, expanding, pushing outward toward the Coalition's flanks with a force that had no right to be doing anything except surviving. I had to pull 2 of my units off the main push to deal with the flank pressure, Zereth said. 2 units that were supposed to be driving toward the settlement core, because a line sergeant with 1-3 of his people already down decided on his own, without orders, to make my life difficult. One of the commanders at the table, a younger Vothrek named Sirith, leaned forward slightly. He was buying time, he said, waiting for reinforcements. That is what I thought, Zareth said. I was wrong. There were no reinforcements coming. He knew that. His own communications confirmed it. Afterward, Canerdil was not buying time because he expected help. He was buying time because he could not stop himself from fighting, because giving up was not a conclusion. His mind would reach on its own. Zareth let that settle. He took a wound in the second hour, he continued. My units reported a direct hit. I was told he was down. 20 minutes later, he was directing his people from a different position, moving on his own, one arm tied off with a strip from his own uniform. The medical systems we recovered later showed the wound should have been disabling. For most species it would have been. He treated it himself in the middle of a firefight and kept going. There was a low sound from somewhere at the table. Not quite disbelief. More like the involuntary noise a person makes when something lands somewhere unexpected. Zareth moved on. He talked about a human field medic named Diane, no last name in any record he ever found, just Diane, who was not a combat soldier. Her role was care, not fighting. She carried no offensive weapon. And yet across a 6-hour engagement in open ground under direct fire she crossed exposed terrain 11 times to reach wounded human soldiers and pull them back to defensible positions. We targeted her, Zareth said flatly. My unit commanders identified her as a force multiplier. Keeping their wounded alive kept their morale intact and their numbers in the field. It was correct tactical thinking. We fired on her directly, multiple times. He looked at the table. She kept moving. Either she was very lucky or she had decided that the possibility of being hit was not going to be the thing that stopped her. I do not know which. What I know is that she did not stop. Not once. Not for the entire engagement. He described the rest of the battle. The same flat, careful tone. The way the humans improvised defensive positions from rubble and equipment that should not have been usable as cover. The way they communicated, not just through their tech but through sound. Gesture motion with a speed and ease that suggested they had trained together so long they barely needed words. The way they fought, not as a collection of individuals following instructions, but as something more like a single organism that happened to be distributed across multiple bodies. When it was over, Zareth said, my force held the settlement. Technically, we had achieved the stated objective. We were in control of the ground. He looked at Reel for the first time in several minutes. Of my battalion, 41% were casualties, against a force 1/4 our size in the open with no reinforcements, no air support, no escape route. 41%. He let the number stand alone for a moment. I sent the report to command and recommended that the engagement not be classified as a straightforward removal operation. Command disagreed. They buried the numbers and moved on. He leaned back in his chair. The next morning, he said quietly, human reinforcements arrived. They retook the settlement in under 4 hours. My remaining forces withdrew on my order, because I had nothing left to hold the ground with. The room was still. That, Zareth said, was a minor engagement on a border world nobody cared about. That was humans defending a settlement they probably would have abandoned on their own within the decade. That was not their finest hour. That was not their elite forces or their best commanders. He looked around the room one more time. That was a line sergeant and a field medic and a handful of soldiers, defending a place they had no tactical reason to die for. He folded his hands again. Now imagine what they look like when the fight actually matters to them. Zareth gave the room a moment. He could see the effect his account was having on some of them. Orith, the old Drellin commander, had not moved since the second sentence. He sat with both sets of arms resting on the table and his wide eyes fixed on Zareth with an expression that said he was doing the kind of quiet internal recalculation that experienced soldiers do when new information changes what they thought they knew. Others were less affected. Reel had recovered his composure and was sitting with the careful, neutral look of someone who had decided to wait and then argue the technical points. Two of the younger commanders were exchanging small glances, the kind that communicated doubt without needing words. Zareth did not need everyone to believe him. He needed enough of them to slow this down. I am going to tell you several things, he said. Some of them come from my own experience. Some come from intelligence reports that exist in Coalition archives and have been consistently underread by the people in charge of planning. I will tell you all of it plainly. What you do with it is your decision. He stood up again, not dramatically, just because he thought better on his feet. The first thing I want you to understand is that humans adapt faster than any species we have ever encountered at scale. Not individuals, though that is true as well, but as a military structure, as an institution. They learn from failure in a way that most of our species do not, because most of our species treat failure as a final result. Humans treat failure as data. He moved toward the holographic display and pulled up a section of the intelligence archive, one that most commanders at the table had been given access to but had clearly not reviewed in full. 3 separate coalition weapon systems appeared on the display, rotating slowly. We have used these 3 systems against human forces in various border engagements over the past decade, he said. Small skirmishes mostly, the kind that never rise to the level of formal conflict, the kind that command quietly discourages from being discussed openly. He pointed to the first system. This was deployed against a human patrol group 4 years ago in the Ivan corridor. First deployment, it was highly effective. The humans had no counter for it. They took significant losses. The engagement report was positive. He paused. The second time we deployed it 8 months later, in a different sector, the humans had already developed a passive screening measure that reduced its effectiveness by 60%. The third time, 14 months after the first use, they had a full countermeasure running. The weapon was essentially useless against them by that point. He pointed to the second system, then the third. The same pattern. Different timelines, slightly different outcomes, but the same pattern. We use something new against them, they lose people to it, they study it, they solve it. They do not need us to give them the information. They take the information from the damage itself. He let his hand drop from the display. We have been giving them weapons, tutorials every time we have engaged them, and we have been too comfortable with our own superiority to notice what they were doing with the lessons. Real spoke up. Our new platform systems are beyond anything they have seen before. The reverse engineering argument does not apply if there is nothing left to reverse engineer. That is a reasonable point, Zareth said, and several people at the table looked surprised that he agreed. If every ship and every weapon we send is destroyed completely and no fragment remains, then yes, they cannot study the technology. But that requires a kind of total and instant victory that the numbers on the display have never reliably produced against them before. I am not saying they will reverse engineer our new systems. I am saying they will find another way to counter them, because that is what they do. He moved away from the display and began to walk slowly along the edge of the table, not to be threatening but to keep the room's attention moving. The second truth I want you to hear is about their cohesion, he said. I have fought 6 species in serious military engagements over my career. Every one of them, when under sufficient pressure, experiences a degradation of unit coherence. Not cowardice, I am not talking about cowardice, but the natural structural stress that comes when things are going badly. Communication breaks down. Individual units start making local decisions that conflict with the broader plan. It is normal. It is what we build command structures to manage and delay. He stopped walking. I have reviewed every engagement report involving human forces that exists in coalition archives. There is no reliable pattern of this happening with them, not at the scale you would expect. There are individual cases of panic, of course they are not machines, but at the unit level, in sustained engagements, even when they are losing, their squads hold together in a way that I have not seen any other species maintain under the same conditions. He looked at the table. I have spoken to xenobiologists about it. The most credible explanation they have given me is that it comes from something in their evolutionary history. The humans spent a very long time in environments where staying together was the difference between surviving and not. Whatever the origin, the result is that their smallest fighting units are more durable under pressure than our equivalent formations. He continued. The third truth is the one I think matters most, and it is the one I expect to face the most resistance about. He stopped at the center of the room. Again, humans are not afraid of us. Vril made a quiet sound that was almost a laugh. A couple of the other commanders stirred. I want to be precise about what I mean, Zareth said before anyone could argue. I'm not saying they have no fear. They have fear. Their own writings about it are extensive. They have entire philosophical and cultural traditions built around managing and understanding the feeling of fear. I am saying they are not afraid of us. Specifically, of the coalition, of this fleet, this plan, this war. He let that land. We intercepted personal communications from human military personnel 3 months ago, he said. Soldiers who at that point already knew this campaign was being planned. Letters to family, notes to comrades, the kind of private, unguarded writing that tells you what someone actually thinks when they are not performing for an audience. He looked around the room. The tone in those communications was not the tone of a people facing extinction or even serious defeat. It was the tone of people preparing for a difficult job, focused, purposeful. Some of it was even, and I want you to hear this clearly, anticipatory. He paused again to let the word settle. They were not afraid. Some of them were almost looking forward to it, not out of recklessness or stupidity. Their communications showed clear, careful thinking about the risks. But underneath the thinking was something steady, something that did not shift even when the writing acknowledged how serious the threat was. He looked at Vril. Fear is one of the most powerful tools an attacking force has, he said. It softens a defense before the first shot. It degrades decision-making. It creates the internal pressure that makes units break. If the enemy has already decided that fear is not going to govern their response, you have lost the tool before the battle begins. And against humans, we have lost it. He sat back down. I am not telling you we cannot win, he said. I am telling you that the plan in that presentation does not account for any of what I have just described. And if we commit that fleet under those assumptions, we will not be fighting the enemy we think we are fighting. We will be fighting the real one. The room was quiet again. This time it was a different kind of quiet. Even Vril was not moving. The vote took place 3 hours later. In those 3 hours, Zirith made his case. Twice more in different ways to different groups of commanders who came to him in the side corridors of the vessel during the recess. He spoke to Orith at length, and Orith listened with the weight of someone who had learned to trust the accounts of soldiers who carried the specific kind of weariness that came from surviving something that should not have been survived. He spoke to 2 of the Drellin fleet, commanders who had pulled him aside with genuine questions rather than challenges. He could not speak to Vril because Vril had spent the recess in a sealed room with the coalition's political liaisons, and when he emerged, he wore the expression of someone who had been reminded of what this war was actually for, and it was not military strategy. When the vote was called, it went 6-3 in favor of proceeding. Zirith was not surprised. He was tired but not surprised. The machinery of this campaign had been running for a long time before anyone brought it to a war council. The council had been a courtesy, not a decision point. The decision had been made in offices on the home world by people who did not sit in rooms like this one and did not carry the memories that Zirith carried. He accepted the secondary command assignment without argument. It placed him on a vessel near the rear of the primary formation, close enough to observe, far enough from the main command structure that his input would not reach anyone who had the authority to act on it in real time. He understood what that meant. Someone in the chain had made sure it was arranged that way. He took the assignment and began preparing his ship. Across a great distance, in human-controlled space, the news of the vote arrived within 36 hours. It arrived in a quiet room aboard a human fleet carrier called the Steady Hand, a large vessel, not new, not glamorous, but solid in the way that Ships built to endure tend to be solid. The room was not a grand war chamber. It had a long table, a row of displays. On one wall, a water dispenser that had been slightly broken for the past 6 months and that everyone had simply learned to tap a certain way before using. It was a working room, not a ceremonial one. Colonel Grace Mercer read the intelligence package at the table, alone at 4:30 ship time before anyone else on her senior staff had arrived. She read it through once quickly, then went back and read the key sections again more slowly. She paid specific attention to the fleet composition data, the projected jump coordinates, and the intercept of the Coalition War Council proceedings that our intelligence team had flagged as verified and reliable. She spent a few minutes with the intercept of the descending voice, the one the analysts had identified as a Vathrek war commander named Zerith Dawn. She read his words as they had been translated, noting the places where the translator had added uncertainty markers, because certain expressions did not convert cleanly between languages. Even with those gaps, the meaning came through clearly. He had told them the truth and they had voted against it. Grace set the document down and looked at the wall for a moment. She was not a dramatic person. She did not speak aloud to empty rooms or make speeches to herself in quiet moments. She simply looked at the wall, thought through several things in sequence, and then reached for a comm unit and began making calls. By 600, her senior staff was assembled. Pete Larson, her communications officer, was the first one in. He was young for his rank, quick thinking, and had the useful habit of arriving early enough to have already run through the morning signal traffic before anyone else needed it. He handed Grace a summary as she was still pulling up the main display and said, "Outer relay stations are already flagging increased coalition activity in the jump corridors." He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, with no performance attached to it. Grace nodded and kept working. Danny Webb arrived next, her tactical officer, a man of medium height with the kind of permanent focus in his expression that made new crew members think he was always slightly annoyed. He was not annoyed. He was thinking. He had been doing that particular kind of thinking since receiving Grace's 4:30 message, and when he sat down he placed 3 different fleet positioning models on the table and said, "I think they are coming from these 3 vectors. I can eliminate one of them based on fuel logistics. That leaves 2. Grace looked at his models. She pointed to the second one. "That one," she said. Danny considered it. "Agreed. I had the same instinct." Running 4th revision now. The rest of the staff came in over the next 15 minutes. There was no announcement, no ceremony. Grace told them what was coming, told them the timeline as best she could, calculated, and told them what she needed from each of them. The room worked. People moved. Displays updated. Communication lines opened to other vessels in the fleet, to the outer system posts, to the reserve wing that Grace had already decided to move up before anyone had technically given her the order to do so. A junior officer named Carl, who had been on the carrier less than 4 months, asked quietly whether they should be concerned about the fleet size differential. Grace looked at him, not unkindly. "We are always outnumbered," she said. "That is not new information. Work the problem in front of you, not the number on the display. Carl nodded and went back to his station. At 900, Grace stood in front of the full tactical display alone for a few minutes. The coalition fleet markers were beginning to appear on the outer edge of the projection space. Preliminary positioning, the kind that happened before a jump formation was fully established. Red on one side, the soft gray of humanity's fleet on the other. She studied the red formation for a long time. She could see what it was trying to do. It was the kind of plan that looked very clean on a display, sweeping, overwhelming, designed to be decisive before a response could be organized. It was a good plan against most opponents. It was a plan that assumed the thing it was hitting would behave the way most things behaved when hit. It assumed a center that could be struck, a command structure that could be decapitated, a defensive line that would hold in one place and eventually break. She thought about the number 7 to 1 and what it meant and what it did not mean. Then she turned back to her staff and said, "Move the reserve wing. I want them at the forward line before that formation completes its jump setup, and flag every approach vector where their formation shows a gap in lateral coverage." Danny looked at the display and then at her. "They left 3. I see 4, Grace said. Danny looked again. A few seconds passed. "You're right," he said. 4. He turned back to his work without ceremony. Nobody in the room said anything dramatic. The displays updated, orders went out, and the carrier moved with the quiet efficiency of a crew that had trained for a long time and was now doing what training was for. Far away, the coalition fleet finished forming up. The countdown began. The coalition fleet jumped on schedule. It was a large and impressive thing to see. Zareth watched it from the secondary command vessel's observation deck as the main formation dropped out of jump space and into position. Hundreds of ships lined up in the sweeping arc that Vriel's plan had sketched out, filling the space between the jump perimeter and the outer edge of human-controlled territory with enough firepower to reduce a mid-sized planet to quiet rubble. For about 40 seconds, the formation looked exactly like the holographic display in the war room. Clean, overwhelming, mathematically decisive. Then the humans moved. They did not move the way the plan expected. The coalition's tactical model had predicted a defensive line, a row of human ships holding a perimeter, absorbing pressure until it broke. What happened instead was that the human fleet dissolved, not in retreat, not in panic, but deliberately and quickly, breaking into groups that fanned outward in multiple directions at the same time before the coalition formation had finished establishing its spacing. Zareth watched from his position and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. He had seen this before. Not at the scale, but the shape of it was the same. Connor Dale reorganizing his people into 3 outward pushes before the coalition's main force had even fully arrived. The same instinct. The same refusal to sit still and be hit. Scaled up 1,000-fold, applied to a fleet engagement, but the same thing. Underneath, the coalition's formation was designed to crush a center. There was no center to crush. Within the first 20 minutes, Vriel's command structure was dealing with Contact reports coming from 6 different directions at once. The human strike groups were not engaging the coalition fleet's main body, they were going around it, pushing into the gaps between coalition vessels, targeting the communication relay ships that were supposed to keep the formation coordinated. The coalition's lateral coverage had 3 gaps, then 4. Zareth had counted 4 from the beginning, but by the time he had tried to raise it with the main command, the jump had already been committed. The human ships moved fast, not faster than coalition vessels in raw technical terms, but faster in their decisions. A coalition ship that lost contact with its command relay waited for instruction. A human ship that lost contact with its command relay made its own call and kept moving. That difference multiplied across hundreds of engagements happening simultaneously in the same stretch of space became enormous very quickly. By the second hour, Vreel's flagship had gone silent. Nobody confirmed it was destroyed. The communication simply stopped, and no response came on any channel, and after a while the absence of response was its own kind of confirmation. Command passed to the next ranking officer, who passed it again 20 minutes later when his ship took damage severe enough to knock out his primary systems. The coalition's command structure was not built for this kind of pressure. It required a clear line downward and a reliable line upward, and what it was getting instead was noise and silence in alternating waves. Zareth's secondary vessel was not in the main engagement zone. He watched it from the edge on the displays and through the viewport when ships came close enough to be visible. He watched a coalition heavy carrier lose a third of its systems to a human strike that came from an angle the carrier's defensive array was not pointed toward. He watched 2 coalition destroyers try to box in a human vessel and find, when the geometry resolved, that they were boxed in themselves. He watched the math of 7 to 1 become, over the course of hours, something that looked much less comfortable. He gave the orders that were within his authority to give. He pulled 2 vessels back from an exposed position before they were flanked. He rerouted a supply ship that would otherwise have flown into the middle of an engagement it had no business being near. He did the work that was in front of him the same way he always had, and he did not let himself think too far beyond it. In the 4th hour, his vessel was boarded. The whole breach was clean and targeted. Not an accident of battle damage, but a deliberate forced entry through a section of the ship that a human strike team had clearly scouted or calculated in advance. Zareth's crew went in defensive positions. The fighting in the corridors was short and one-sided in a way that Zareth had expected from the moment the breach alarm sounded. He had made a decision before any of this began. He had thought about it in the quiet hours after the vote, in the long run, to the jump in the hours of watching the battle unfold from the edge. He had thought about what kind of person he was and what kind of war this was and what it meant to fight hard for something you had told the truth about and been ignored about. When the human strike team reached the command deck, Zareth was sitting at the central station alone. His weapon was on the table in front of him, powered down. His crew had evacuated through the rear corridors on his order, moving toward the emergency life pods. The command deck systems were still running, but no orders were going out on them. The team leader was a human male, medium height, with the compact and efficient way of moving that Zareth had come to associate with experienced human soldiers. The name tape on his uniform said Owens. He swept the room quickly, catalogued it, and landed on Zareth with an expression that showed awareness but no hostility. Zareth spoke in the human language he had spent 3 years quietly learning after the Carven border engagement. It was not a perfect accent, but the words were clear. "I voted against this war," he said. Owens did not react with surprise. That itself told Zareth something. He studied the human for a moment and then said, "You already know that. We intercepted the council record," Owens said. His voice was even and direct. "Your vote was flagged. Your full statement was translated and passed up the chain." He paused for a moment. "You described us pretty accurately." Zareth looked at the men. "I described what I had seen." "That's usually how it works," Owens said. There was no theater in the exchange. No victory speech, no gloating, no drawn-out moment of dramatic significance. Owens called in the rest of his team, and Zareth was escorted from the command deck with a calm and organized efficiency that Zareth had expected and still found somehow notable. Nobody was rough. Nobody was cruel. The team moved with purpose and treated Zareth as a person who had surrendered, rather than as a problem to be managed. And that distinction, small as it sounds, mattered to him. He was taken to a holding area on the human carrier, clean, functional. Nothing like the retaliatory conditions that coalition doctrine would have. Assigned to a captured enemy commander. He was given water and a cot and a window, and he used the window. Outside, the battle was winding down. The coalition fleet was withdrawing in fragments, the coordinated arc of Vriel's grand formation scattered into smaller groups of vessels heading in different directions, trying to reach jump range before the human strike. Groups caught up with them. It looked nothing like the display in the war room. It looked like what it was. Grace Mercer came to see him the following morning. She was not what he had expected, though. He could not have said exactly what he had expected. She was calm in the specific way of someone who had done a hard thing and was already thinking about the next hard thing. She did not seem interested in savoring anything. She told him his account to the council had been read in full. She told him that a soldier who tells the truth in a room that does not want to hear it is doing a harder thing than most soldiers ever face. She did not say it like a compliment. She said it like an observation, the way a fellow professional might acknowledge something technical and precise. Zareth looked out at the stars beyond the viewport for a moment. The hardest part, he said, was not the vote. Grace waited. The hardest part was knowing what they were walking into, he said, and not being able to stop it. The vote was just a formality for something that had already been decided. The real war was in the council room, and we lost it before anyone fired a single shot. Grace said nothing to that. She did not need to. She nodded once and left him to his window and his thoughts. Zareth stayed there a long time, watching the stars, thinking about a flat, cold world 12 years ago, about a sergeant named Connor Dale who would not stop fighting, and a medic named Diane who would not stop moving, about every truth that had been handed to the coalition freely and clearly, and every time those truths had been set aside in favor of a number on a display. He thought about the kind of enemy that could not be broken by fear, that learned from damage, that stayed together under pressure, that fought not because it had no choice but because it had decided to. He thought about that for a long time. Then he sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the holding room, picked up the pen that had been left there, and began writing the full report that he had never been allowed to finish 12 years ago. Not for the coalition's command, not for the record, just to put it somewhere outside of himself, somewhere that existed apart from memory and doubt and the long wait of being right about something that had cost everyone around him so much. He wrote for hours, and when he was done, he set the pen down and looked at what he had written, and felt for the first time in a very long while that he had finally said the whole truth of it. It did not change anything that had happened, but it was honest, and that at the end of all of it was the only thing he had ever had to offer.